Ellen Marsh looked at the clock on the wall and felt her stomach drop. 40 minutes. The doors would open to parents and students in 40 minutes, and the boy who was supposed to play piano for the choir was nowhere to be found. His phone rang and rang with no answer. Around her, 20 students in their choir robes stood frozen, watching her face for some sign that everything would be fine. It did not look fine. "Did anyone call his house?" she asked, her voice tight. "His mom said he has a fever," said a girl named Priya Nolan, holding her own phone like it might explode. "He's not coming. He's really sick." Ellen pressed her fingers against her temples. 6 months of practice, 6 months of learning harmonies, fixing timing, building confidence in a group of teenagers who had never sung in front of more than 50 people. And now, with the auditorium about to fill with 300 parents and neighbors and local reporters from the small town paper, there was no one to play the piano. "Can anyone here play?" Ellen asked the group, scanning face after face. Heads shook. A boy named Tyler Banks admitted he had taken 2 lessons when he was 7 and quit because he hated it. That was the best offer she got. Backstage, past the thick red curtain, the noise of the crowd was already growing. Chairs scraped. Voices rose and fell. Somewhere out there, a radio host who had promised to mention the show on his morning program the next day was already seated in the 3rd row with a small notebook in his hand. This was supposed to be the choir's biggest night of the year, the night that might convince the school board not to cut the music program's funding again, and it was about to fall apart before a single note was sung. That was when Priya glanced toward the side hallway and saw a familiar figure pushing a cart of cleaning supplies past the doorway, unaware of the crisis unfolding just a few feet away from him. "Wait," she said suddenly. "What about Mr. Webb?" A few heads turned. Marcus Webb was the school's evening janitor, a quiet man in his 50s who had worked at Lincoln High for 11 years. He waxed the floors, fixed the broken lockers, replaced burnt-out lights in the gym, and moved through the hallways after school hours with a kind of gentle, unnoticed rhythm. Students greeted him the way people greet furniture they walk past every day, with a nod, if that. Nobody really looked at him. Nobody really wondered about him. "The janitor?" Tyler asked, and a ripple of laughter moved through the group, quiet but unmistakable. "Priya. He pushes a mop bucket around. He's not going to know how to play piano." "I saw him," Priya insisted, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "Like 2 weeks ago. I stayed late for a project, and I walked past the auditorium, and he was standing by the piano. He wasn't playing it, but he had his hand on the keys, just resting there, like he was thinking about something. It was strange. I never told anyone because it felt private, like I wasn't supposed to see it." Ellen looked at the clock again. 36 minutes. She had nothing to lose, and everything to lose all at once. "It's worth asking," she said, already moving toward the side hallway. "Go get him, please, right now." Priya ran. Down the hallway, past the closed classroom doors, she found Marcus exactly where she expected, kneeling beside a supply closet, replacing a roll of paper towels with the calm patience of a man who had done the same task 1,000 times before. He looked up when he heard her sneakers squeaking against the floor. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that had learned long ago not to draw attention to itself. "Mr. Webb, we need help," Priya said, breathless. "Our piano player didn't show up, and the show starts in like 30 minutes, and Miss Marsh doesn't know what to do, and I told her I saw you at the piano a couple weeks ago, and I know this sounds crazy, but do you know how to play, even a little?" For a moment, something flickered across Marcus's face, quick and hard to read. It was not surprise. It was something closer to fear, the kind of fear that comes from being asked to open a door that has been shut for a very long time. "I used to," he said carefully, standing up and wiping his hands on his gray work pants, "a long time ago." "Please," Priya said. "We really need someone, anyone, even a little bit would help." Marcus hesitated. He looked down the hallway toward the auditorium doors, where the noise of the gathering crowd drifted through the walls like a tide coming in. 11 years he had walked past that piano every single night, cleaning around it, dusting its lid, sometimes touching its keys after everyone had gone home, playing softly enough that no one would ever hear. 11 years of keeping a part of himself locked away, folded up small, tucked into a corner where it could not hurt him anymore. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said quietly. "Please," Priya said again, and this time there was something in her voice, some mixture of desperation and hope, that made him pause. "The kids worked so hard. Some of them have never even been in a real show before. If there's no music, there's no show. Please, Mr. Webb." He looked at her for a long moment, then, almost against his own will, he nodded. "Show me where," he said. They walked quickly back to the backstage area, where Ellen Marsh was pacing in tight circles, glancing every few seconds at the small gap in the curtain where she could see the crowd continuing to grow. When she saw Marcus enter, dressed in his work uniform with a faint smell of floor cleaner still clinging to his clothes, she blinked in surprise, then quickly composed herself. "Mr. Webb," she said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming. I know this is a strange thing to ask, but we're desperate. Priya said you might be able to help us out." "I haven't played in front of people in a long time," Marcus said. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." "We don't need perfect," Ellen said. "We just need something. The kids know the songs. If you can follow along even loosely, it will be enough. Please, we don't have another option." Behind her, a few of the choir students exchanged glances, and one of the older boys, a tall junior named Daniel Cross, folded his arms and let out a short laugh under his breath. "This is going to be a disaster," Daniel muttered to the boy standing next to him, not quite quiet enough. "The janitor is going to play piano in front of the entire town? Come on." A few students snickered. Priya shot Daniel a sharp look, but the damage was already done. The mood backstage shifted. The nervous energy of the choir now mixed with something colder, something closer to embarrassment. Marcus heard the laughter. He had heard laughter like that before, quiet and dismissive, the kind that did not need to be loud to sting. He felt his resolve wavering, the old instinct to disappear back into the hallway, back into the safety of his cart and his mop and his quiet, unnoticed life. But then he looked past Daniel, toward the small group of freshmen standing near the back, kids who had probably never performed anywhere bigger than a school cafeteria before, their faces pale with nerves, their eyes searching for any sign of reassurance. One of them, a small girl with braces and a choir robe that was slightly too big for her, looked at him with a kind of raw hope that reminded him of something, though he could not immediately place what. 20 minutes, Ellen said gently. "I know it's a lot to ask. But the auditorium is through there, and the piano is on the stage. Would you at least come look at the music with me, just to see if it's something you could manage?" Marcus took a breath. Somewhere deep inside him, a door that had been closed for over 2 decades creaked, just slightly, on its old hinges. "Show me the music," he said. Ellen handed him a folder of sheet music, slightly worn from months of rehearsal, filled with pencil marks and small notes in the margins. Marcus flipped through the pages slowly, and something in his expression changed as his eyes moved across the notes. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, an old and half-forgotten reflex. "This is manageable," he said quietly, almost to himself. Ellen's eyes widened. "You can read music?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he closed the folder and looked toward the small gap in the curtain, where the noise of the crowd was steadily rising, chairs filling, voices overlapping, the whole town gathering for a night that was supposed to celebrate a group of teenagers who had worked hard for something they believed in. Somewhere in that crowd were parents who had taken time off work, grandparents who had driven long distances, and neighbors who had come simply because that is what small towns do for each other. "Give me a few minutes with it," Marcus said. "Then I'll try." Ellen nodded, relief and disbelief mixing on her face in equal measure. She turned to the choir, clapping her hands together to gather their attention. "Everyone, places. We start in 15 minutes." As the students scattered to arrange themselves for the opening number, Priya lingered for a moment near Marcus, watching him study the pages with an intensity she had never seen from him before. His eyes moved quickly, efficiently, the way someone reads a language they have not spoken in years but never truly forgot. "You're going to be great," she said, though she had no real way of knowing that. Marcus looked up at her, and for the briefest moment, something like a smile crossed his face, faint and uncertain, but real. "We'll see," he said. He walked toward the stage entrance, the folder of music held against his chest, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. Behind the curtain, the auditorium buzzed with the restless energy of a crowd waiting for something to begin. On the other side of that curtain sat a piano that had been silent under his hands for 11 years, waiting, as it turned out, for exactly this moment. Marcus did not know it yet, but the next few minutes would change the direction of his entire life. He only knew that his hands were trembling, and that somewhere behind that heavy red curtain, 300 people were waiting for a show to begin, completely unaware that the man walking toward the piano used to dream of playing in halls far bigger than this one, before life had quietly and firmly closed that door. He stepped through the gap in the curtain and onto the stage. The lights were brighter than he expected, warm and golden, washing over the polished wood floor and catching the edges of the old piano that sat waiting at the center of everything. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen, one hand still holding the folder of sheet music, the other hanging loosely at his side. From where he stood, he could see the shapes of the audience beyond the stage lights, rows and rows of faces he could not quite make out, but whose presence pressed against him like a physical weight. A ripple of murmurs moved through the front rows as people noticed the man in the gray work uniform crossing the stage instead of the teenage accompanist they had been expecting. A few parents exchanged confused glances. Somewhere near the back, a child asked loudly why the janitor was on stage, and a soft wave of laughter followed, quickly hushed by embarrassed parents. Marcus felt the heat rise in his face. He kept walking anyway. He reached the piano bench and set the folder down on the music stand, his hands steadier now than they had been backstage, though his heart was still pounding against his ribs. He glanced toward the wings, where Ellen Marsh stood watching him with an expression caught somewhere between hope and worry, and where Priya gave him a small, encouraging nod. He sat down. The bench was cold beneath him, the same bench he had dusted 100 times without ever truly sitting on it. He adjusted his position, the way he used to, long ago, before life had taken a hard turn and quietly rearranged all of his plans. He flexed his fingers once, twice, feeling the old familiar stretch in his knuckles. Behind him, he could hear the soft rustle of the choir stepping into their opening positions, could feel the nervous energy radiating from 20 teenagers about to sing in front of the biggest crowd of their young lives. The room fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional cough or the creak of a chair. Marcus placed his hands on the keys. For one long, terrifying second, nothing happened. His mind went completely blank, the notes on the page in front of him blurring into meaningless shapes. Somewhere in the audience, someone whispered something to the person beside them, and a few quiet chuckles rippled through the crowd again, the kind of laughter that comes from people who have already decided what kind of night this is going to be. Then Marcus closed his eyes. And he began to play. The first notes rang out clear and soft, filling the auditorium with a sound so unexpected that the laughter died in an instant. It was not the shaky, uncertain playing anyone had braced themselves for. It was smooth, confident, and full of a quiet kind of beauty that seemed to reach into every corner of the room. The choir behind him, startled for a half second by how strong and steady the music was, found their footing and began to sing. Ellen Marsh, standing in the wings, felt her breath catch in her throat. She had expected Marcus to fumble through the notes, to play carefully and cautiously, the way someone who has not touched an instrument in years might be expected to play. Instead, his hands moved across the keys with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a man who spent his evenings mopping floors and fixing broken door hinges. There was an ease to it, a naturalness, as if the piano had simply been waiting all this time for him to remember it existed. In the front row, a woman named Carol Whitfield, whose daughter Grace stood in the second row of the choir, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Is that really him? Is that the janitor?" Her husband, just as stunned, only shook his head slowly, unable to look away from the stage. The song moved into its second verse, and Marcus's fingers found a small flourish between the vocal lines, a delicate run of notes that had not been written into the sheet music but somehow fit perfectly, adding a layer of warmth to the melody that made several people in the audience sit up a little straighter. Priya, standing just off stage where she had been assigned to help manage props, pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and something close to pride. Daniel Cross, who only minutes earlier had been mocking the idea of Marcus playing at all, stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his arms no longer crossed, his expression slowly shifting from smugness to something far more complicated. He had expected to be embarrassed for the choir. Instead, he found himself unable to look away. As the song built toward its final chorus, something in Marcus seemed to change. His shoulders, which had been tense and guarded when he first sat down, slowly relaxed. His eyes, still closed, seemed to be somewhere far away, lost in a memory that had nothing to do with the auditorium or the crowd or the 11 years he had spent trying not to think about music at all. For a brief, private moment, he was not a school janitor playing an emergency accompaniment. He was simply a man reunited with an old friend he had been forced to leave behind. The final notes rang out and faded into silence. For one heartbeat, the auditorium was utterly still. Then the applause broke, loud and sudden, rolling through the room like a wave. Parents rose from their seats. Someone near the back let out a sharp whistle. The choir, still slightly stunned by what had just happened behind them, exchanged wide-eyed glances before remembering to bow. Marcus opened his eyes. He blinked at the bright lights, at the sea of clapping hands and smiling faces stretched out before him, and for a moment he looked almost afraid, as if he had forgotten, in the middle of playing, that anyone was watching at all. He glanced toward the wings, where Ellen Marsh stood with tears in her eyes, clapping so hard her palms had turned pink. The show was not over. There were 4 more songs to play, each one requiring him to sit back down at that piano and do it all again, this time with the shock of the first performance still ringing in everyone's ears. But something had shifted in the room, something that could not be undone. Nobody was laughing anymore. Between songs, while the choir rearranged themselves for the next number, Ellen leaned close to Marcus and whispered, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Marcus did not answer right away. He looked down at his hands resting on the keys, hands that had spent years gripping mop handles and screwdrivers and boxes of cleaning supplies, hands that had, apparently, never fully forgotten what they used to be capable of. "It's a long story," he said quietly. "I'd like to hear it sometime," Ellen said, and there was something genuine in her voice, something that made Marcus believe, for the first time in a long while, that someone might actually want to know. The rest of the show passed in a kind of blur for Marcus. Song after song, his fingers moved with growing confidence, old muscle memory returning faster than he could have imagined, each piece pulling him a little further out of the careful, guarded shell he had built around himself over the years. By the final number, an upbeat arrangement that had the whole choir swaying and smiling, he found himself smiling too, something he could not remember doing on this stage, in this school, in longer than he wanted to admit. When the final song ended, the applause was even louder than before. The choir bowed together, and this time, Ellen gently pulled Marcus up from the piano bench and guided him to stand beside the students, insisting he take a bow of his own. He resisted at first, deeply uncomfortable with the attention, but the students on either side of him, including Priya, and even, surprisingly, Daniel, urged him forward with encouraging nods. He bowed, briefly and awkwardly, and the applause somehow grew even louder. Backstage, once the curtain had closed and the audience had begun filing out into the cool evening air, chaos of a different kind broke out. Students crowded around Marcus, firing questions at him all at once. Where had he learned to play? Why had he never told anyone? Could he teach them something sometime? Priya stood near the edge of the group, beaming, occasionally catching Marcus's eye like she still could not quite believe what she had witnessed. "I told you," she said, grinning. "I told everyone you could do it." "You didn't know I could do that," Marcus said, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You just hoped." "Same thing," Priya said with a shrug, and a few of the students around her laughed. Ellen made her way through the crowd of students and stopped in front of Marcus, her expression serious now, though her eyes still shone with excitement. "Mr. Webb, I don't think you understand what you just did. That performance was incredible. I've been teaching music for 15 years, and I don't hear playing like that very often, not even from professional musicians who come to guest at our concerts." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable with the praise but unable to fully dismiss it either. "I used to study piano seriously, a long time ago, before I started working here. It's been a long time since I've played for anyone." "Why did you stop?" Ellen asked gently. The question hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. Marcus's expression clouded slightly, the easy warmth of the evening giving way to something more guarded. "Life happened," he said simply. "Things came up. I had to make choices." Ellen sensed the weight behind his words and did not push further, though the question clearly stayed with her. "Well," she said instead, "I hope you know you have an open invitation to that piano anytime you want it. It's been sitting there collecting dust for years. It's a shame it's been wasted." "It hasn't exactly been wasted," Marcus admitted, a faint, sheepish look crossing his face. "I may have played it a little, after hours, when no one was around." Ellen raised an eyebrow, surprised but not entirely shocked. "So you weren't a total stranger to that piano before tonight?" "Not entirely," Marcus said. Outside the auditorium, parents lingered in small clusters, still talking about the mysterious janitor who had saved the show with what several of them were already calling the best piano performance the school had seen in years. Phones had come out during the final songs, capturing shaky video clips that would, within hours, begin circulating among students and parents across the small town, shared with captions expressing disbelief and admiration in equal measure. Marcus had no idea, as he gathered his cleaning cart and prepared to finish his usual evening rounds, that a video of him playing that opening number had already been posted online by one of the students, or that it had, within the first hour, been shared and reshared dozens of times across the local community pages. He simply pushed his cart back down the quiet hallway, the applause still echoing faintly in his ears, feeling something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt seen. As he moved through the darkened school, replacing light bulbs and locking classroom doors as he always did, his mind wandered back through years he usually kept carefully sealed away. He thought of a small apartment with a second-hand piano wedged into the corner of the living room. He thought of a teacher who had once told him he had a rare gift, the kind that came along only once in a great while. He thought of a scholarship letter, thick and official, that had once represented the beginning of everything he had ever wanted. And he thought, as he always eventually did on the nights when memories crept too close, of the reason all of that had slipped so completely out of his hands. The next morning, when Marcus arrived at the school earlier than usual to prepare for the day, he found Ellen already waiting for him near the front office, a folder tucked under her arm, and an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. "Mr. Webb," she said, before he had even set down his cart, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer." Marcus felt a flicker of unease. "What is it?" Ellen held up her phone, the screen displaying a video that had, by that point, been viewed thousands of times overnight. "Have you seen this?" Marcus stared at the small screen, watching himself sit down at the piano the night before, watching the crowd's confusion turn slowly into stunned silence. He had not seen it. He had not even considered that someone might have recorded it. "People are asking about you," Ellen continued. "Parents, a few teachers, even someone from the local radio station reached out to the school this morning, asking if they could speak with the piano player from last night's show." Marcus's stomach tightened. "I don't want any of that," he said quickly. "I just filled in because you needed help. That's all this was supposed to be." "I understand," Ellen said gently, sensing his discomfort. "But I have another request, and this one is completely up to you. No pressure at all. The spring concert is coming up in a few weeks. It's a much bigger event than the talent show. The biggest one of the year, actually. I would like to ask you to perform a solo piece, just you and the piano, as part of the program." Marcus opened his mouth to refuse immediately, the old instinct to disappear rising up fast and strong. But something in Ellen's expression, something patient and hopeful, made him pause. "I'll think about it," he said instead, surprising himself. "That's all I'm asking," Ellen said, smiling. "Just think about it." As she walked away, Marcus stood alone in the quiet hallway, his cart beside him, his heart caught somewhere between fear and a feeling he had almost forgotten the name of: hope. He did not yet know that saying yes to that solo performance would eventually change not just his own life, but the lives of several people around him, in ways none of them could have predicted on that ordinary Tuesday morning. Marcus did not sleep well that night. He lay awake in his small rented house on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room, letting his mind drift back to a version of himself he had spent years trying to forget. He had been 17 the first time a teacher told him he had something special. Her name was Miss Alvarez, a patient woman, with silver-streaked hair, who taught piano lessons out of a small studio above a bakery 2 streets from his childhood home. His mother had scraped together the money for lessons after noticing how often young Marcus lingered by the piano at his aunt's house during family gatherings, picking out melodies by ear long before anyone had taught him a single note. Within 2 years, he was performing in regional competitions, collecting ribbons and small trophies that lined the shelf in his bedroom. Within 3, Miss Alvarez was telling his mother, in a voice thick with excitement, that Marcus had a rare gift, the kind that came along perhaps once in a teacher's entire career. She began preparing him for something bigger, a scholarship audition at a respected music conservatory, several hours from their small town, the kind of opportunity that could change the entire direction of a young man's life. Marcus remembered the audition itself only in fragments now, the nervous energy in his stomach, the cool weight of the concert hall's silence, the way his hands had trembled slightly before the first note, and then steadied completely once he began to play. He remembered, most clearly of all, the letter that arrived 3 weeks later, thick and official, confirming that he had been accepted with a full scholarship covering tuition and housing for 4 years. He remembered his mother crying at the kitchen table when she read it, not from sadness, but from a pride so overwhelming she could not find words for it. For a short while, everything had seemed certain. Marcus spent that final summer before leaving for the conservatory, practicing for hours every day, preparing for a future he had dreamed about since he was old enough to reach the piano pedals. Then, 6 weeks before he was due to leave, his father collapsed at work. The details of what followed were the parts of the memory Marcus avoided most carefully, even now. Even after so many years, his father's illness turned out to be serious, the kind that required extended treatment and long hospital stays. The kind that came with medical bills that piled up faster than his family could manage. His mother worked 2 jobs already. There was no one else to help care for his younger siblings, no one else to pick up the extra shifts that suddenly became necessary just to keep the household afloat. Marcus made the decision quietly, without much discussion, the way people sometimes make the decisions that end up shaping the rest of their lives. He deferred his scholarship for 1 year, telling himself it would only be temporary, that he would return to it once things stabilized at home. He took a job at a hardware store to help with bills. He learned to fix things, to work with his hands in ways that had nothing to do with music. 1 year became 2. His father's health improved slowly, unevenly, with setbacks that kept the family in a constant state of financial strain. The scholarship deferral, it turned out, had a limit, and by the time Marcus reached out to the conservatory again, the opportunity had quietly expired, reassigned to another student whose life had not taken the same sudden turn his had. He told himself in those early years that it was only a delay, that he would find another way back to music eventually. But responsibilities have a way of multiplying instead of shrinking. His father's illness left lasting effects that required ongoing care. His younger siblings needed help finishing school. Marcus took on more hours, then a second job, then a third, each one pulling him further away from the piano and further into a life he had never planned for himself. By the time his family's situation finally stabilized, Marcus was nearly 30, and something inside him had changed. The dream that had once felt so close, so achievable, now felt impossibly distant, wrapped up in a version of himself he barely recognized anymore. He told himself he was too old to start over, too far behind the younger musicians who had spent the past decade training while he had spent his working double shifts and filling out overtime forms. He stopped playing almost entirely. It was easier, he had told himself, not to touch the keys at all than to sit down and feel the full weight of everything he had lost. The janitorial position at Lincoln High School had come along almost by accident, a favor from a family friend who mentioned the school was hiring and thought the steady hours and decent benefits might suit him. Marcus took the job without much thought, expecting it to be temporary, a way to steady himself while he figured out his next move. 11 years later, he was still there, and the piano in the auditorium had become, without his ever fully admitting it to himself, the closest thing he had to a connection with the life he once imagined for himself. Lying awake that night, replaying the talent show performance over and over in his mind, Marcus found himself thinking about Ellen's offer in a way he had not expected. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately, to retreat back into the safety of anonymity that had protected him for so many years. But another part of him, a part he had not heard from in a very long time, whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was not too late to reclaim some small piece of what he had given up. He arrived at school the next day still undecided, and undecided he remained for nearly a week, avoiding Ellen's hopeful glances whenever their paths crossed in the hallway. It was Priya, in the end, who tipped the balance. She found him on a Thursday afternoon, restocking paper towels in the science wing, and settled herself against the wall nearby, with the particular patience of a teenager who has decided not to leave until she gets what she came for. "Miss Marsh told me she asked you to play at the spring concert," Priya said. Marcus did not look up from his task. "She mentioned it. Are you going to do it?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "It's complicated." Priya considered this for a moment, tapping her fingers against her backpack strap. "Can I tell you something? When I first suggested you to Miss Marsh, back when Trevor didn't show up, I wasn't even sure you could really play. I just remembered seeing you at the piano that one time, and I was desperate, and it felt like the only chance we had. I didn't expect what happened next. None of us did." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "But here's the thing," Priya continued. "You didn't just save the show. You reminded everyone that talent doesn't always look the way people expect it to look. There are kids at this school who feel invisible, who think they don't matter, because they're not the loudest, or the most popular, or the best at whatever everyone else values. When you sat down at that piano, and everyone saw what you could really do, it meant something. It still means something. I think if you play again, it could mean even more." Marcus set down the stack of paper towels and finally turned to face her, studying the earnest expression on her young face. "You're pretty persistent for a 16-year-old. 17, Priya corrected, smiling. "And yeah, I get that a lot." Marcus found himself smiling too, despite the heaviness still sitting in his chest. "I'll think about it seriously this time," he said. "That's a promise." That evening, alone in the auditorium after the last students and teachers had gone home, Marcus sat down at the piano the way he had 100 times before, in secret, in the quiet safety of an empty building. But this time, instead of playing softly enough to remain unheard, he let his hands move with the same freedom he had allowed himself on the night of the talent show. The notes filled the empty room, bouncing off the high ceiling, echoing through rows of empty seats. He played for nearly an hour, working through pieces he had not touched in decades, some of them returning to him with surprising ease, others requiring careful, halting effort to reconstruct from memory. By the time he finally stood up from the bench, his fingers ached in a way that felt strangely good, a reminder that some part of him was still capable of stretching toward something larger than the careful, quiet life he had built for himself. The next morning he found Ellen in the music room before the first bell rang. "I'll do it," he said. "The spring concert. I'll play." Ellen's face lit up with a smile so genuine it made Marcus feel, for a brief moment, entirely certain he had made the right decision. "You won't regret this," she said. Word of Marcus's decision spread through the school quickly, carried along the same channels that had spread the video of his talent show performance days earlier. Most of the reaction was warm, curious, and encouraging. Students who had never spoken more than a few words to him began greeting him by name in the hallways. A few younger students, inspired by his story, asked if he might consider giving lessons sometime, but not everyone's reaction was kind. Daniel Cross, who had softened somewhat after witnessing the talent show performance firsthand, found himself under pressure from a small group of friends who seemed determined to find something to mock in the sudden attention surrounding the school janitor. What started as offhand comments in the hallway gradually turned into something sharper. A handful of unkind posts online questioning whether the whole thing was some kind of publicity stunt arranged by the school, whether Marcus was truly as talented as everyone claimed, or whether the video had simply caught him on an unusually lucky night. Marcus tried not to let the comments bother him, but late at night, scrolling through his phone in the quiet of his small living room, he found himself reading them anyway, each dismissive remark landing with more weight than he wanted to admit. Old doubts, the same ones that had kept him silent at that piano for 11 years, began creeping back in. Ellen noticed the shift in him almost immediately. During a rehearsal session one afternoon, she found him staring blankly at the sheet music in front of him, his hands resting motionless on the keys. "Everything all right?" she asked. Marcus hesitated before answering honestly. "I keep wondering if this is a mistake. Maybe the talent show was just a fluke, a lucky moment that people are reading too much into. A real concert is different. People will be paying closer attention. What if I get up there and it isn't the same?" Ellen pulled a chair beside the piano bench and sat down, her expression calm and understanding. "Can I tell you something I've learned in 15 years of teaching music? Talent like yours doesn't disappear just because it's been quiet for a while. What I saw at that talent show wasn't luck. It was years of training and passion that never actually left you, even when life pulled you away from it. The only thing standing between you and that stage now is fear, and fear is something everyone deals with, even the most experienced performers I've ever worked with." Marcus considered her words carefully. "What if I let everyone down?" "What if you don't?" Ellen countered gently. "What if this is exactly the kind of moment that reminds you why you fell in love with music in the first place?" Her words stayed with him through the following days, gradually loosening the grip of doubt that had settled over him. He continued practicing in the evenings, sometimes joined by Priya and a few other curious students who liked to sit quietly in the front rows and listen, offering encouragement whenever his confidence wavered. Slowly, piece by piece, Marcus began reconstructing not just his technical skill, but something harder to rebuild, his belief that he still had something worth sharing. 2 weeks before the spring concert, Ellen approached him with one more request, this one more personal than the last. "I'd like you to play an original piece," she said. "Something you've written yourself, if you have anything like that." Marcus felt his chest tighten at the suggestion. There was one piece, unfinished for over 20 years, tucked away in an old notebook he had not opened since before his father's illness had changed everything. He had started writing it during his final summer before the conservatory, a piece meant to capture everything he felt about the future he had been so certain was waiting for him. He had never finished it. He had never played it for anyone. "I have something," he admitted slowly, "but it isn't complete." "Then finish it," Ellen said simply. "I think it's time." That night, Marcus dug through a box of old belongings in his closet until he found the worn notebook, its pages yellowed with age, the notes on the staff lines slightly faded, but still legible. He sat down at his small keyboard at home, the one he kept for practicing quietly without disturbing his neighbors, and began working through the unfinished melody for the first time in over 2 decades. It took him nearly a week of evenings, working slowly, carefully, allowing himself to feel every emotion the piece stirred up, emotions he had spent years avoiding. By the time he finished the final measures, he sat back from the keyboard, breathing heavily, tears he had not expected gathering in his eyes. The piece was finished. And in 3 days he would play it, for the very first time, in front of an entire auditorium full of people who had no idea what this performance truly meant, to the quiet man who had spent 11 years cleaning their school's hallways, without ever once telling anyone the story he had just decided, finally, to share. The night of the spring concert arrived with a chill in the air, the kind of early evening cold that made everyone in line outside the auditorium pull their jackets tighter, as they waited for the doors to open. Inside, the school staff had transformed the auditorium into something far grander than usual, with strings of soft white lights draped along the walls and fresh flowers arranged near the edge of the stage. This was, without question, the largest event of the school year, drawing not just students and parents, but alumni, local business owners, and a small delegation from the school board who would be deciding, in the coming weeks, whether the music program's funding would survive another year. Backstage, the energy was different from the chaos of the talent show weeks earlier. This time, everything had been carefully planned. Ellen moved between groups of students, checking microphones, adjusting the order of the program, offering quiet words of encouragement to nervous performers. The choir would open the evening, followed by a series of individual performances from students in the school's music classes, building toward the finale, where Marcus would take the stage alone. Marcus arrived early, dressed not in his usual work uniform but in a simple dark blazer that Priya and a few of the other students had insisted on helping him pick out during a quick trip to a thrift store the previous weekend. He stood near the edge of the stage entrance, watching the auditorium slowly fill with people, his heart pounding in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. "You look nervous," Priya said, appearing beside him with her choir robe already on. "I am nervous," Marcus admitted. "Good," Priya said, surprising him. "My old coach used to say that nervous just means you care. If you didn't care, you wouldn't feel anything at all." Marcus managed a small smile. "Your old coach sounds wise." "She was pretty good," Priya said, grinning before hurrying off to join the rest of the choir lining up in the wings. As the auditorium lights dimmed and the program began, Marcus found a quiet corner backstage to sit and steady his breathing. He could hear the choir's opening number drifting through the curtain, the same group of students who had performed weeks earlier, now noticeably more confident, their voices blending together with a polish that had not been there before. The applause that followed was warm and enthusiastic, a promising start to the evening. One by one, the individual performances continued. A shy freshman named Olivia Grant played a violin solo that left the audience murmuring with quiet admiration. A pair of brothers performed a duet on guitar that had the crowd tapping their feet along with the rhythm. Each performance built the evening's energy a little higher, the auditorium settling into the comfortable rhythm of a community gathered together to celebrate something they cared about. Then, with roughly 20 minutes remaining in the program, Ellen stepped out to the microphone at center stage, her expression carrying the particular seriousness of someone about to introduce something meaningful. "For our final performance tonight," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I want to share a story with you, if you'll allow me a moment. A few weeks ago, during our winter talent show, our scheduled accompanist fell ill just before the performance. In a moment of complete desperation, one of our students suggested we ask a member of our own school community for help, someone who works quietly among us every single day, someone most of us have walked past countless times without ever truly knowing." A hush fell over the crowd, curiosity building in the silence. That person agreed to help us, and what happened next changed how many of us think about talent, about opportunity, and about the stories hidden behind the people we see every day, but rarely stop to know. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce our final performer of the evening. He has worked at this school for 11 years, and tonight, for the first time, he will share an original piece he wrote himself, one that has waited a very long time to be heard. Please welcome Marcus Webb. The applause began immediately, warm and curious, as Marcus stepped out from behind the curtain and crossed the stage toward the piano. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, could hear the low murmur of recognition moving through the crowd as people who had seen the talent show video, or heard about it from friends, realized this was the same man they had been talking about for weeks. He sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench slightly, and took a slow breath. The auditorium settled into complete silence, the kind of silence that carries its own weight, heavy with anticipation. For a brief moment, Marcus closed his eyes, and in that darkness, he allowed himself to remember everything that had brought him to this exact point. He thought of Miss Alvarez, patiently guiding his small hands across the keys all those years ago. He thought of his mother crying with pride over a scholarship letter that had once represented everything he dreamed of becoming. He thought of his father, recovered now and doing well, unaware that his son was about to play, for the very first time, a piece written during the hardest and most hopeful summer of his life. He opened his eyes and began to play. The melody started softly, gentle and searching, the kind of opening that seemed to ask a question rather than answer one. It carried the uncertainty of youth, the excitement of standing on the edge of a future full of possibility. Slowly, the piece began to build, layering in richer harmonies, the kind of music that seemed to hold both hope and hesitation in the same breath. In the audience, Ellen watched with tears already gathering in her eyes, recognizing in the music something deeply personal, something that felt less like a performance and more like a confession. Priya, standing in the wings with the rest of the choir, felt a lump rise in her throat as the melody swelled, filling the auditorium with an emotional weight that seemed to reach every single person in the room. The piece shifted into its middle section, the melody growing more complex, more urgent, carrying with it a sense of struggle, of something being pulled away before it could fully bloom. Marcus's hands moved faster now, his fingers navigating the keys with an intensity that spoke of years of longing compressed into a few short minutes of music. Several people in the audience found themselves unexpectedly moved, some wiping quietly at their eyes, though they could not have explained exactly why the music affected them so deeply. Near the back of the auditorium, the radio host who had come to cover the event set down his notebook entirely, no longer interested in taking notes, simply listening. The music shifted again, moving into its final section, and here the melody softened, slowed, taking on a quality of quiet acceptance rather than sorrow. It was the sound of someone who had lost something precious, who had spent years believing it was gone forever, only to discover, unexpectedly, that some part of it had been waiting patiently all along, ready to be found again. The final notes rang out slow and deliberate, each one hanging in the air before fading gently into silence. Marcus lifted his hands from the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. The auditorium sat in complete, breathless silence, the kind that follows something truly extraordinary, a silence so full it seemed to press against the walls of the room. Then someone in the front row rose to their feet, and the room exploded. Applause thundered through the auditorium, rising in waves, growing louder as person after person stood, drawn up out of their seats by something they could not quite name but felt completely. Whistles cut through the noise. Somewhere near the middle of the crowd, someone was openly crying, clapping through their tears without any attempt to hide them. The choir, still standing in the wings, broke into their own enthusiastic applause, several of them exchanging stunned, delighted glances. Marcus sat frozen on the bench for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound washing over him, by the sight of hundreds of people on their feet, applauding not out of politeness, but out of something far more genuine. He had spent 11 years believing his music belonged only to empty rooms after hours, that whatever gift he once had was something meant to stay hidden, tucked away where it could not disappoint anyone, including himself. Standing before him now was proof that he had been wrong. Ellen walked out to the center of the stage, her own eyes wet with tears, and gently guided Marcus to his feet, urging him toward the front of the stage to properly receive the ovation still rolling through the auditorium. He stood there, slightly stunned, bowing awkwardly, his hands trembling not from nerves this time, but from something closer to overwhelming gratitude. Near the front row, Marcus caught sight of a familiar face he had not expected to see in the crowd. His younger sister, Diane, whom he had called only briefly to mention he might be playing something at the school concert, without going into much detail, stood clapping with tears streaming freely down her face. Beside her sat their mother, now in her 70s, her hands pressed together, her expression a mixture of pride and something that looked almost like disbelief, as though she was seeing, after decades of waiting, a piece of her son she had feared was lost forever. Marcus had not known they were coming. Diane later admitted she had seen the talent show video online, recognized the piece he had been quietly working on for years without ever finishing, and suspected, correctly, that something significant was happening in her brother's life. She had made the 2-hour drive with their mother that same afternoon, arriving just in time to slip into seats near the front before the concert began. After the applause finally began to settle and the concert officially came to its close, the auditorium slowly emptied into the cool evening air, though clusters of people lingered near the stage, waiting for a chance to speak with Marcus directly. Parents introduced themselves, complimenting his performance, asking questions about his background, several mentioning they hoped the school might find a way to feature him again in future events. Students who had never spoken to him before approached shyly, telling him how much the performance had moved them, a few even asking, tentatively, whether he might ever consider teaching lessons. Amid the crowd, Marcus found himself pulled into a tight embrace by his mother, her small frame trembling slightly as she held him. "I always believed you'd find your way back to it," she whispered against his shoulder. "I just didn't know when." "I didn't either," Marcus admitted quietly. "I'm sorry it took so long." "Don't be sorry," she said, pulling back to look at him, her eyes still shining with tears. "You did what you had to do for this family, and I have never once regretted the choices we made together. But watching you up there tonight, seeing you finally let yourself play like that again, that is one of the proudest moments of my entire life." Nearby, Ellen approached, waiting patiently for a pause in the family reunion before stepping forward. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I think it's fair to say tonight exceeded every expectation I had, and I had very high expectations." "Thank you," Marcus said, still slightly overwhelmed, "for pushing me to do this. I don't think I would have found my way back on my own." "You would have," Ellen said gently. "It just might have taken a little longer. Sometimes we all need someone to remind us of what we're capable of." As the auditorium continued to empty and the last of the well-wishers said their goodbyes, Marcus stood near the piano one final time that evening, resting his hand lightly on its worn wooden surface. 11 years of quiet, private conversations between himself and this instrument had led, finally, to this moment, to a room full of strangers and neighbors and family members, who now understood, in ways they never had before, exactly who had been quietly caring for their school's hallways all this time. He had no way of knowing, as he finally gathered his things to head home that night, that the video of his performance, uploaded by a local news reporter who had attended the concert, would reach far beyond the walls of Lincoln High School by the following morning, or that his quiet, private story was about to become something the entire region would soon be talking about. By the time Marcus arrived at school the following morning, the video had already spread far beyond anything he could have imagined. What had started as a single upload from a local reporter had, overnight, been shared across dozens of community pages, picked up by a regional news station, and reposted by several accounts dedicated to sharing uplifting stories from ordinary life. The footage, only 3 minutes long, showed him walking onto the stage in his simple dark blazer, sitting down at the piano, and playing the original piece that had waited 20 years to be heard. By mid-morning, it had been viewed more than 200,000 times. Marcus found out about the scale of it only when he arrived at the front office to pick up his morning schedule and found the school secretary, a woman named Carla Jennings who had worked at Lincoln High almost as long as he had, staring at her phone with wide eyes. "Marcus," she said, looking up as he walked in, "have you checked your phone this morning?" He shook his head, pulling his old phone from his pocket. The screen showed dozens of notifications, more than he had ever received at once, messages from numbers he did not recognize, along with several missed calls from unfamiliar local area codes. "What's going on?" he asked, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. Carla turned her own phone toward him, showing the video, now sitting at the top of the local news website's homepage under the headline, "The Janitor Who Waited 20 Years to Play His Song." Below it, a scrolling comment section filled with messages from strangers, many of them expressing how deeply the performance had moved them, several sharing their own stories of dreams they had set aside for family or circumstance, drawing inspiration from watching Marcus reclaim something he had once believed was lost forever. "It's everywhere," Carla said. "The morning show wants to talk to you. So does the newspaper. I already told them I'd pass along the message, but I wanted you to hear it from me first, not from some stranger cornering you in the hallway." Marcus stood in the office, phone in hand, feeling a mixture of disbelief and a creeping sense of vulnerability. For 11 years, he had built a quiet, careful life, specifically designed to avoid this kind of attention. Now, seemingly overnight, that careful privacy had dissolved entirely, replaced by a level of visibility he had never asked for and was not entirely sure he wanted. He spent the morning attempting to focus on his usual work, though it proved nearly impossible. Students stopped him in the hallways, some asking for photographs, others simply wanting to shake his hand or tell him how much the video had meant to them. Teachers who had exchanged little more than polite hellos with him over the years now sought him out during their free periods, eager to hear the full story behind the performance. By lunchtime, Ellen found him in the auditorium, sitting quietly at the piano he had come to think of as his own, staring at the keys without playing anything at all. "This is a lot, isn't it?" she said gently, sitting down beside him. "I don't know what to do with any of this," Marcus admitted. "I only ever wanted to help with the talent show. I never expected any of it to turn into something so big." "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," Ellen said. "But I do think it's worth considering that this attention, as overwhelming as it feels right now, might be an opportunity. Not just for you, but for other people too." Marcus looked at her, uncertain. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ellen said carefully, "that there are people out there, kids and adults both, who feel exactly the way you felt for all those years. Like their dreams are behind them. Like it's too late to reclaim something they gave up. Your story, whether you intended it or not, is telling all of them something important. It's telling them it's never too late." Marcus considered her words in silence for a long moment, his eyes drifting back to the piano keys beneath his hands. Over the following days, the requests continued to arrive, steady and increasing. A local community college reached out, inviting him to consider teaching an evening piano course for adult students, many of whom, the department head explained, had similar stories of abandoned musical dreams, and were looking for exactly the kind of guidance someone with his background could offer. A regional orchestra, having seen the video, extended an invitation for him to attend one of their rehearsals as a guest, with the possibility of a future guest performance discussed as well. Even a small independent record label reached out, curious whether he might be interested in recording the original piece he had performed at the concert. Marcus approached each opportunity with the same careful hesitation, unwilling to rush into decisions that might upend the steady, familiar life he had built for himself over more than a decade. He spent long evenings weighing each option, discussing them with his mother and sister during phone calls that had, since the concert, become more frequent and more open than they had been in years. "You don't have to choose everything at once," his mother told him during one such call. "You can take this slowly. There's no rule that says you have to become someone completely different overnight." Her words settled something in him. Over the following weeks, Marcus made a series of careful decisions. He agreed to the evening teaching position at the community college, drawn to the idea of guiding other adults who, like him, believed their creative dreams might be permanently out of reach. He declined the recording opportunity for the time being, feeling that the piece he had written held a kind of personal significance that he was not yet ready to share beyond the walls of that auditorium. He did, however, accept the orchestra's invitation to attend a rehearsal, curious, despite his hesitation, to reconnect with a wider musical community he had been separated from for so long. What he did not do, to the surprise of several people who assumed his newfound recognition would lead him away from Lincoln High School entirely, was quit his job as the school's evening janitor. "People keep asking me why I'm still doing this," he told Ellen one evening, several weeks after the concert, as they sat together in the empty auditorium, after the last of the day's activities had ended. "Like it doesn't make sense anymore, now that everyone knows I can play." "Does it make sense to you?" Ellen asked. Marcus considered the question seriously before answering. "This job saved me, in a strange way. It gave me something steady when everything else in my life had fallen apart. I found this piano because of this job. I found Priya, and you, and this whole community because of this job. I don't think I need to leave it behind just because people expect me to." Ellen smiled, understanding immediately. "Then don't leave it behind. Build something new alongside it instead." That was exactly what Marcus began to do. He continued his evening rounds at the school, the same quiet, steady work he had done for over a decade, but now he added new layers to his days. Twice a week, he drove to the community college after his shift ended, teaching a small group of adult students who arrived with the same nervous hope he remembered feeling as a teenager decades earlier. Some of his students were parents who had set aside music to raise children. Others were retirees finally returning to instruments they had abandoned in their youth. A few were simply curious adults who had seen his story online and felt inspired to try something they had always secretly wanted to attempt. Priya, who graduated from Lincoln High the following year, remained close with Marcus throughout her final months at the school, often stopping by the auditorium after her own classes to practice alongside him or simply to talk. She eventually decided to study music education in college, crediting the events of that winter talent show as the moment she truly understood the impact a single teacher, or in this case, a single unexpected performer, could have on an entire community. Daniel Cross, whose earlier comments had stung sharply in the weeks following the talent show, approached Marcus privately near the end of the school year, offering an apology that surprised them both with its sincerity. "I said some things I shouldn't have," Daniel admitted, standing awkwardly near the auditorium doorway one afternoon. "I didn't know anything about you, and I judged you anyway. I'm sorry." Marcus considered him for a moment before responding. "We all make assumptions about people sometimes, especially about people we've decided aren't worth getting to know. I appreciate you saying that." "For what it's worth," Daniel added, "that performance at the concert was one of the best things I've ever seen. I've watched the video probably 20 times. Marcus allowed himself a small laugh. "That means more than you probably realize." As the school year drew to a close, Lincoln High's administration, moved by the story that had unfolded within their halls, and eager to formally recognize the moment, announced plans to dedicate the auditorium's piano in Marcus's honor. During a small ceremony held on the final day of classes with students, staff, and a handful of local reporters gathered in the auditorium, Principal Harold Bennett unveiled a small brass plaque affixed to the piano's frame. The plaque read simply, "Talent doesn't ask for permission to exist." In honor of Marcus Webb, whose music reminded this school that every person carries a story worth hearing. Marcus stood beside the piano during the ceremony, surrounded by students who had, over the past several months, come to know him not as an invisible presence in the hallways, but as someone whose quiet dedication and hidden talent had left a lasting mark on their community. When Principal Bennett invited him to say a few words, Marcus hesitated only briefly, before stepping toward the small microphone set up near the stage. "I spent a long time believing that some doors, once closed, were closed forever," he said, his voice steady, despite the crowd gathered before him. "I want anyone here who feels that way about something in their own life to know that isn't always true. Sometimes the door is just waiting for you to knock again, even after a very long time. I'm grateful, more than I can properly say, that a group of students gave me a reason to knock on mine." The applause that followed was quieter than the thunderous ovation from the spring concert, but it carried the same warmth, the same genuine appreciation that had first surprised Marcus on the night everyone expected him to fail, and instead watched him remind an entire auditorium what it looked like when someone finally stopped hiding. In the months that followed, Marcus continued teaching his evening classes, continued his work at the school, and slowly, carefully, began writing new music for the first time in over 2 decades. He never became famous in any grand sense, never pursued the kind of spotlight that fame typically demands. But within his small community, and increasingly beyond it, his story continued to circulate, shared by people who had watched the video and found themselves thinking, perhaps for the first time in years, about the dreams they had quietly set aside somewhere along the way. Ellen often told the story to new students who joined the choir each year, using it as a reminder that talent could be found in the most unexpected places, and that judgment, especially the kind formed too quickly and based on too little information, almost always turned out to be wrong. Priya, years later, still working toward her degree in music education, would sometimes tell the story to her own classmates, describing the evening a nervous choir director, desperate and out of options, had turned to a quiet janitor who had spent 11 years hiding an extraordinary gift behind a mop and a cleaning cart. She would describe the laughter that filled the room in that first uncertain moment, and the silence that replaced it the instant his hands touched the keys, and the way that single decision, made in a moment of pure desperation, had quietly changed the course of several lives at once. And Marcus, whenever he sat down at that piano now, whether teaching a nervous adult student their very first scale or simply playing alone in the quiet hours after the school had emptied for the evening, carried with him the memory of that particular kind of silence. The one that comes right before something unexpected and wonderful happens. The one that reminds anyone who has ever doubted themselves that it is never too late to sit down, take a breath, and finally let the world hear what has been waiting, patiently, all along.